Hello and welcome to Farside Friday. My name is Farah Bala. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm calling in from the land of the original people of Lenape and Canarsie, which is today called Queens, New York. I'm also the founder of Farside. We are a leadership and organizational development consultancy. And Farside Friday is an initiative that started almost a year ago in response to the very active anti-Asian hate rhetoric and the anti-Black rhetoric on the backs of the violence and murders of our Asian American brothers and sisters and our Black brothers and sisters. And Farside Friday has continued as a video podcast that highlights very crucial conversations and amplifies voices of marginalized and oppressed communities whose voices are part of our current movement towards equity, inclusion, and anti-oppression. And so today's focus is on disability advocacy. And I just want to share really quickly as to why this conversation and why now. As a coach and consultant, as we've been working with our clients, there has been an active leaning into organizations saying we have to do better. And almost every time I ask the question, where are you not able to move the needle as much as you'd like? Or where have you not done as much work as you'd like? Invariably, we hear disability. We haven't done much there. We haven't done anything there. And I've just had a bunch of these conversations in the last few months. And so that was the motivation of creating space for a conversation on disability, but it's also important to have the disability community lead this conversation, which is what will be happening today. Before we get into introductions, we want to introduce you to our space of access. Closed captioning has been enabled. And so if you would like closed captioning, in the bottom Zoom settings, I believe you will, there is a tab for subtitles, and you can enable subtitles for yourself. As you can see, we also have ASL interpreters on our call, Teresa and Julia, who will be alternating throughout our time together today. If there are any other spaces of access that you would suggest we incorporate, we'd love to hear from you. Farside Friday is a space to create dialogue, to be in dialogue. We are really activating our capacity to listen and learn from each other. There is no pressure or intention to solve any issues. There is no pressure for our speakers to be experts. We are here to be in dialogue and talk to each other. Finally, in terms of acknowledgement, it is heart-wrenching to acknowledge the immense loss of life, not just in this last year, but especially in these last 2 weeks, most recently in Boulder, Colorado, and last week in the hate crime murders in Atlanta. And so before we officially start off this conversation, please join me in a minute of silence to commemorate the lives lost throughout this world to hate, to racist rhetoric, to oppressive rhetoric. And please join me in a minute of silence. Thank you. Thank you all. All right, friends. Please join me in giving a hearty welcome to our first Farside Friday guest host, Eric Harris, who is Director of Public Policy at Disability Rights California. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Farah. My name is Eric Harris, and to give a visual description of myself, I'm an African-American male with short black hair, with a beard and a mustache. And I am currently wearing glasses and a light purple polo shirt, and I am in a room that is with white walls. I have a mirror behind me that is a mirror closet, and a door that is closed, and currently with a black cat somewhere in this room behind me. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm really, really looking forward to this discussion today. And I want to thank Farah and Farside Friday for this conversation being led by a group of people who are really passionate about disability. I also want to make sure that I wish everyone a happy Women's History Month. The other leaders who are a part of this conversation all happen to be women. And I really, really wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that. The leaders in the disability community, especially the leaders who are women, the leaders who are trans, the leaders who are other gender identities need to be lifted up. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that. And we are very excited today to have the individuals that we have. I'd love to start off by making sure that I welcome all of them and allow them to give their description, their background, a little bit about themselves, and of course, why they're excited about this conversation today. So first, I'm going to start off with Kenna Chic. Kenna, if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself to the audience.
This is Kenna. Thank you, Eric, for your lovely introduction. My name is Kenna Chip, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am an East Asian woman with black glasses and long brown hair. I'm also wearing a blue sweater, and behind me are just various very organized objects from a fake Zoom background. And a little more information about me. I have been a disability advocate for the last 10 years. Most of my work has been focused on mental health resources and peer support, especially in the college setting. I'm very excited to be here today with you all just to talk more about difficulties that the disability community faces, especially touching on topics related to people who have invisible disabilities. Thank you again so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Kenna. This is Eric speaking. Next, I'm going to have Gabrielle Ficchi introduce herself. Dr. Gabrielle Ficchi, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Eric. Hi, guys. I'm really happy to be here. As Eric said, my name's Gabrielle. I go by Gabby most of the time. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I identify as a disabled woman myself, so I'm currently sitting in a room by myself with a beige wall behind me in my power wheelchair. I have curled blonde and brown hair with a black shirt and black blazer on. I have been a mental health therapist and disability advocate for over 10 years now, so I'm really excited to have this conversation and really just bring a lot of these issues to the table. I think this conversation needs to be had in a lot more spaces, so I'm excited to be doing this today with all of you.
Thank you so much, Gabby. We really appreciate it. Next, Liz Campos, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and describing yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Campos, and I am a mixed Latina. What that means is that I have a family in the Caribbean and in Central America. I have my hair pulled back, it's black, and I'm wearing a leopard shirt, leopard Liz, right? Trying to keep it exciting for you guys. I identify as a blind woman. So I am blind, have been blind for over 20 years. I am an orientation and mobility instructor with Society for the Blind. So my job is to teach other blind people how to advocate for their needs on a day-to-day basis. So I'm really excited just to be here to share my experiences in having to advocate for myself and in being able to teach my students how to advocate for themselves as well.
Thank you so much, Liz. This is Eric speaking. And just to give you all a brief background of myself, as Farah mentioned earlier, I am the Director of Public Policy at Disability Rights California. I have been in that position only for a couple of months now, but I have been working at Disability Rights California for for now over 2 years. I have been a disability advocate for almost 15 years in different areas, whether it was as a student at the University of Arizona, where I played wheelchair basketball, then as a law student at the University of Oregon School of Law, and in various opportunities for internships and jobs in Washington, D.C., at the American Association for People with Disabilities, at the Democratic National Committee in Washington, at the House of Representatives, working for Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who represents the East Bay area of California. And then, of course, working in Sacramento in different areas of politics and policy at the local, state, and federal levels. As everybody has mentioned, we are all very, very excited to be here. And part of this conversation it will be certain basics that the disability community has and disability advocates have with each other and with other advocates. And then some of these conversations and questions that we will answer are a little bit deeper into the weeds of what disability advocates are working towards in making the society that we all live in more inclusive for all people with and without disabilities. So the first question that I'm going to ask our panel is a basic one. What would you like the world to know about disability? And I'm going to start with Kenna, if you wouldn't mind giving your response to that.
This is Kenna. Thank you so much for that question, Eric. What I would like the world to know about disability is that, firstly, we are the largest minority in the country. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 people have disabilities. However, within that group, that also includes people with invisible disabilities. I feel like a lot of times when we talk about disability, there is this expectation that it's just a white guy in a wheelchair, which traditionally a lot of advocates have been. But at the same time, there are so many people who live with invisible disabilities, people with psychiatric disabilities such as depression or schizophrenia, people with other disabilities relating to their immune system or relating to diabetes, etc. And so because of that, I think that sometimes a large misconception that people have about disability is that it has to look or be seen a certain way, when in reality, there's so many people with disabilities that live in this country that you for sure know someone with a disability. They just either may not identify themselves as a person with a disability, or they may not talk openly about their disability because there's some stigma facing what they're going through, and not a lot of people understand it. And so that's just one thing that I wanted to bring up very early on in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Kenna. Liz, do you have a comment on that question?
Absolutely. So one of the things about disabilities that I find very interesting is that it can be situational, right? So if you think about me being a blind woman at the grocery store, I'm 6 foot tall. And if I were at the grocery store with a friend who say is 5'1", okay, and she's trying to get an item off the top shelf, in that situation, my disability has nothing to do with my ability to be able to get an item for someone else, right? So I think that really thinking about what situations we're in, when I'm at home, blindness doesn't even cross my mind because it's something that I just do. I'm at home, I'm cooking, cleaning, it's natural. There is no disability there. But that's not always the situation or the case. So sometimes, one of the things I tell my students a lot is that the world was not designed for blind people. And so that is actually where the disability comes from, not from us not being able to see, but not having access to the things that we need because the world is not prepared for us, adapted to meet our needs. So I think that's one thing that I really want people to know is disability can be situational. It could be based on a perception. It just, when one of the most, evident examples that I have is the blind man who helped people get out of the towers during 9/11, right? Totally blind with his guide dog. He was able to lead people off out of like the top floor down to safety. Because it was situational. His eyes never worked, but he knew the building very well. So I think, again, it's just situational.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Liz. And Gabby, I'm going to go to you, and I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what Liz just mentioned, that our society is an ableist society in so many ways. It has been normalized to say that our society does not fit a community of people with disabilities, whether it is our streets, our buildings, our schools. Can you talk a little bit about that in your response to the question?
Sure, thanks, Eric. This is Gabby. I think the first thing that comes to my mind to kind of piggyback off of what Kenna said is not only are we the largest minority, but we're an equal opportunity minority. So you can join our community at any point in your life. You can be born with a disability, you can acquire a disability through an accident or something like that, or you can age into being a part of the disability community. So most people at some point in our lives, whether they identify that way or not, will be part of the disability community. So I think to piggyback off of what you were saying, Eric, our society is not really set up to handle that right now, right? And I think one of the biggest issues and what I want people to know is that because it affects and can affect literally everybody in the world, there needs to be a wider perception of this is a communal responsibility. It's not just the responsibility of the disabled person to make schools more accessible, to make public places more accessible, to make sure we have accommodations in place. That's up to everybody. And for some reason, when we mention disability, it becomes a very isolated experience or like an us and them type of situation. When to reach equality, which there also seems to be a misconception that we have more equality than we do for some reason. We definitely don't right now, unfortunately. And to reach that, it's going to take everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gabby. And this line of our thinking and our perception also, brings to my attention terms that are used. A lot of people with and without disabilities use terminology about disability that is outdated, in many situations is offensive, but it isn't always people who are bad actors who are using these terms. In many cases, as I'm sure you all will be able to attest, it's due to ignorance, people just not interacting very often with people with disabilities or just not knowing that the terms that they are using are outdated or offensive. So I'll give some examples of terms that we have heard, of course: handicapped, retarded, differently abled, crippled, and other terms. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm going to start off with you, Liz, can you talk a little bit about for you personally and others that you have worked with in the disability community, what terms you are either most comfortable with, and then alternatively, what terms are outdated and what terms you and others in the community believe should not be used anymore.
Great, thank you. So, this is Liz. One of the things that we really strive to do in the blindness community is get people comfortable with using the word blind. We know that there's a lot of negative ideas and connotations behind the word blind, and that's the problem that the blind community is facing, that there are just so many negative ideas, so many misconceptions, so many nightmarish tales about being blind, that when a person hears the word blind, they think it's terrible, and therefore they don't want to use it to describe this very nice young lady who just walked into the room, because they feel like they are offending that person, when in reality, blind is the word that is most accepted in our community, mainly because we want it to be something positive. When we think about blindness, we don't think about a negative. We think about all the people who are out there living their lives, getting married, having babies, going on vacation. That's what blindness is, not Stevie Wonder, not Ray Charles, not any of the people that we see in the media, the blind beggar. A lot of people want to use terms like visually challenged, visually impaired, low vision. A lot of people will say, I'm not blind, I just can't see everything, but using the word blind, right? Some of the understandings in my own personal life about using other words other than blind have been that I was using it to explain why there was something wrong with me. Visually challenged, visually impaired was coming from a place of brokenness. I was not a whole person because I could not, I wasn't blind enough to be blind, not sighted enough to be sighted. And it wasn't until I really understood what the word blind meant that I could start using it more comfortably, that I started encouraging my family, especially Spanish speakers, because in Spanish, some of these words may sound harsh. Ciego, ciega, right? Encouraging them and letting them know that that is the appropriate word. I am not visually challenged. I am not visually impaired. I am blind. And that's coming from a whole perspective, a whole person that can tell you that my eyes don't work, but everything else about me that I need to function does, right? So really being okay with using that word blind. It's not offensive. It's not degrading. It's not demeaning. It's an umbrella term that can cover the multitude of conditions that there are that can cause blindness, from diabetic retinopathy to being born blind from birth. Blind is that one umbrella term that is just, it covers everything, takes out the whole explanation. And we really want people in the public to start using that word more comfortably without the negative connotations behind it. So just say I'm blind.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Liz. I really appreciate your response. Gabby, I'm going to go to you next for your response to the question of terminology, terms that you've heard or you've experienced in your advocacy work that you think should not be used anymore, and then terms that should be embraced and should be used within the community as well as others who are allies.
Sure. This is Gabby. This is a little bit of my soapbox, so I'm going to try to be brief. But I think some of the terms that I hear most often, a lot of my work is focused on helping families who have children with disabilities. And for some reason, the term that they've coined is special needs. And that's a big one for me that I think we should get rid of. I think there's a problem with separating our needs as special, right? Because then you're creating, again, that us and them kind of situation. Our needs are not special. They don't make us like a separate category of people. They're just what we need to function. And as long as we keep making that separation, I think we're adding to the problem. So instead of special needs, instead of the euphemisms that you mentioned, Eric, like the differently abled and the, like you'll see DIS written really small and then ability written really big. And it's just like, I don't know why we're not using the word disabled. That's what I am. That's what most of the people in the community are. And I don't think it's a bad word. And I like Liz was saying about blindness, I don't think it should have a negative connotation, because for me, and it's taken me a long time to make this shift, but it's part of my identity, right? It's a part of who I am. I am a proud disabled woman. And I think as long as we shy away from using that word, we're spreading the message that there's something wrong, not just with the word, but with being disabled, with being who you are. And if we can come at it from a pride perspective, I think that helps change the narrative. So just call it what it is. Disabled is not a bad word.
Thank you so much, Gabby. I really appreciate that. And I know, Kenna, you have a perspective on this as well. So Kenna, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, this is Kenna. I think this is a wonderful question. And so approaching it from sort of the mental health community, actually, it's been very interesting because it's almost like we face the opposite situation where people are so casual with these terms. You know, we would hear people say like, oh, you know, like the weather's so bipolar because it was raining one minute and then it was sunny the next minute. Or we'd hear people say things like, oh, that misplaced tile is bothering me. I'm so OCD, you know, haha, as a joke. And I think so it's very interesting that in certain cases we see when people respond to certain situations that are, you know, just very normalized by using mental health and psychiatric disability language, it actually tends to sort of downplay the you know, impacts of living with said disorder or said psychiatric disability. And so I think it's very interesting where we see some of these differences in which we use these terms within our language. For example, the most common one that we hear that we don't really think is problematic is the word crazy, which has been a term that's been used throughout history to discredit people by making the claim that there's something wrong with their brains. And so it's very interesting to see that, you know, these are not terms that we really think about on a daily basis as something that can be harmful to a specific community or is in reference to a specific community, yet historically we see that it is. And so I think sometimes, you know, definitely the change in languages may end up, you know, these terms being used in a different way, but I think definitely in remembering the historical importance of them is also something that I'd like us all to keep in mind.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Kenna. And just to follow up with what the three speakers just said, these terms are important. They have impact, whether they are spoken terms or written terms. They have impact on the community, on people with disabilities, on our family members, on our friends, and these terms, especially disabled, and both the person first language and identity first language have been advocated for by people with disabilities, by disabled people for generations. And I'm using both terms, disabled people and people with disabilities, interchangeably because person first language, people with disabilities, was fought for hard for generations of advocates throughout the country, especially individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, to really make sure that it was clear to the community, to the country, and throughout the world that they are people first, that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are people first. They've had to fight long and hard for the right to be recognized as people first. And then there are many in the disabled community now, especially, who with various disabilities want to be identified as disabled people. I am a disabled Black man. That is who I am as I identify. And I think that it is important to recognize these terms and also recognize the terms that have been used in the past to make sure that we do not go down that path anymore to continue to use terms that have been offensive to communities. And as Kenna mentioned, and as others have mentioned, we use terms so nonchalantly now, such as crazy, for instance. Somebody will mention, I've had a crazy day, or the weather is crazy. or, that's that crazy such and such. And people really need to be careful when they use all of these terms because of the offensive nature that they take. So I'm going to go to the next question on our list. Advocacy in education. We have all been students at some point, whether it was in elementary school, coming through middle school or high school, or as collegiate students. And so I'm going to start off with you, Kenna. The importance of being a student advocate, making sure that students have access to the services that they need, the accommodations that they need. And this comes from not just the student's perspective, but as you know, and as you can talk about, schools are often centers for resources for everybody in a community. In certain cities and towns, the school or university, it might be the largest source for these resources in a given city. So can you talk a little bit about advocacy for people with disabilities on campuses, whether it's been elementary, middle school, and high school campuses, or collegiate campuses?
This is Kenna. Yes, I can definitely talk about that. As I mentioned, a lot of the work that I've done has been around college campuses. One of the things that we would see a lot actually is that a lot of times in order to receive any type of accommodation, because of the nature of certain invisible disabilities, there would be the requirement of having some sort of doctor's signature or vouching in a certain way to ensure that the student isn't, quote, faking it, and that they actually are a person with lived experience of disability. What ends up creating a lot of barriers, though, is when students don't really have access to these specialized doctors or psychiatrists or psychologists who could provide that for them. So at my college campus, I went to a school in DC, and what ended up happening was that because our school didn't have the amount of counselors that could meet longer term needs for students, as well as it being very expensive to go off campus in the DC area, a lot of students just went on without receiving the support that they needed. It's very interesting because I think sometimes in mainstream conception, there's this idea that, oh, these are college students, they should be able to handle it. I don't know why they have these needs. When interestingly, actually, a lot of times, a lot of mental health disabilities start developing around college times. And so a lot of these people may be experiencing symptoms of their mental health disability for the first time and may need support navigating that. But the difficulty was at my campus and across so many campuses across the entire country, there wasn't really a system set in place that could adequately support students in an accessible, affordable, and culturally competent manner. And so what ends up happening is that students may, be put on medical leave, students may be hospitalized, students may drop out. And all of these situations are completely avoidable if universities were able to create systems that were supportive of students. What I ended up doing in my advocacy was actually creating a fund to help students who couldn't really seek support on campus or off campus without it. A lot of times, especially as I mentioned, being in DC, therapy was extremely expensive, to $100 to $300 per session. We would also have students who just couldn't, because of their cultural backgrounds, couldn't really have conversations with their parents saying, okay, I need therapy, this is why. In a lot of cultures, it's extremely taboo. In a lot of immigrant communities, especially, there is a level of immigrant guilt where, because your parents were refugees or just moved to a new country and have so many other issues that they went through, like how can you as the descendant of them complain, in quotes, about your life and what you're going through? And so there's definitely so many aspects that touches on why students wouldn't be able to receive the support that they need, that I think a lot of the times the people who wrote the policies around what receiving support would look like may not have considered. And so because of that, the fund that I created actually ended up helping students at least with their first few appointments, just because that would create a system in which students are actually encouraged to continue seeking help once they're referred off campus, which happens to a lot of students. For me, the idea behind it was that we just wanted to ensure that students were able to thrive on campus and not just survive or have some of these other horrible events happen to them as a result of the universities not really understanding their needs, or in some worst case scenarios, the university just, deciding that this is a student with a disability, this is a student with a mental illness, therefore they might not, fit here academically, in quotes again. And I think it's one of those things where we can talk about, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is, this law that allows a lot of disability or a lot of people with disabilities to receive accommodations and to access resources and access spaces the way that a non-disabled person would. These laws definitely exist. And, we've had the 30th anniversary of the ADA, very recently, which shows that this law has been in effect for a while, but we do see a lot of times that, in practice, there are still so many hurdles, especially for young disabled people who are getting to know their disability identity for the first time on a college setting, go through. And so that was definitely some of the work that I did, and some of the work that I think would definitely continue to be helpful for the community, especially as younger folks with disabilities learn to navigate these institutions that weren't really built to support them in the first place.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Kenna. Really appreciate your perspective and your great advocacy work in this space. Liz, I'd like to go to you next. You work with other blind individuals, and you have a perspective working with a lot of different people. And what would you say about advocacy as a student or advocacy around schools?
Great. This is Liz. So, in my profession, advocacy for blind students, we want it to happen as early as possible. And what that means is parents, when they have a child and the child goes blind all of a sudden, or it's their first blind child, they don't know what they need. It might be like, I don't even know what to ask for. And what ends up happening is you go to school and then you end up getting told like, oh, this is probably the best for this child, or they're falling behind because they can't see the board. Let's put them in a special ed class, when that's absolutely not necessary, right? So again, it's that situational thing where that student's needs may not be getting met. However, instead of looking at it that way, they're saying, oh, this child is blind, so therefore they must have some cognitive problems, or they may not be able to retain information. So by default, saying blindness equals some other kind of disability or learning disability, right? So advocating for a blind person needs to start early, because as you start to get a sense of yourself, right, like Kenna said, as you start to realize more things about what your disability means and what it doesn't mean, those advocacy skills are going to come in handy, right? So a lot of times when I get parents and, I'm telling them, you are your child's best advocate right now, because your child doesn't really know what to ask for. So really helping parents prepare themselves and saying, like, what do you want your child to accomplish, and how do you think they're going to do that? Advocacy, right? Speaking up for oneself. As I deal with people that are a little bit older, college age students, and even working adults, one of my favorite things to tell them is a closed mouth doesn't get fed, right? If you don't speak up, if you don't say, hey, this isn't working for me, it might have worked for the last blind person, but it's not working for me, then no one's ever going to know how to help or how to adjust things. And one of the things that I see a lot in the blind community is just saying, well, that's kind of how it is, and you figure you adjust and you regroup, and great, we're resilient, that's wonderful. But sometimes it involves just teaching other people and advocating and saying, hey, this is why this is not working. I know that there can be some guilt sometimes, especially when I'm trying to teach people who are shy or that don't like to make waves, or they think that they're asking for too much or that they're being a burden. That's where, you know, the whole concept of advocacy really has to be broken down. You know, it's not a burden. You aren't, you know, taking extra time because this is something that should have been thought of in the first place, right? So accessibility can be such an afterthought, but if people really just took a second and thought about, hey, can a blind person get on this website to register for college classes? Hey, can a blind college student get onto this website to turn in their homework assignment? If someone would have just taken like 5 minutes when these things were being developed to think about the blind person using it, then we wouldn't have to come back and advocate, right? So really trying to put that into perspective for my students and helping them understand like, hey, we're just speaking up because you have the same right as anyone else does to an education. You have the same right anyone else does to get your textbooks on time for class, right? You have a right as much as anyone to sit anywhere in the classroom, not near the door just because you're blind and it's the first seat there. You can sit all the way in the back if that's what you want. That's where advocacy comes in, and it's not always easy. It doesn't mean that you're always going to get a positive response when you ask for things. So that's part of what my job is teaching people like the process of advocacy, how it works, how sometimes it doesn't work, how sometimes you can get things right when you need them, how sometimes it could be a very big process, how sometimes you might be the first blind person to have entered this room and asked for this accommodation. And that's why it's gonna, you know, take a little bit of work for them to figure it out. Advocacy for me, when I'm teaching it, it just goes so much beyond just telling people what you need, but also your attitude, having patience to know that this person that I'm talking to may not have the solution. So I might have to call 2 or 3 or 4 people to get the help that I need. So it's just, there's just so many layers to it. But honestly, the best advice I can give when you are trying to advocate for something is be informed, right? So if you're a college student that can't, you know, just lost your vision and you're trying to figure out how you can go to school, then finding out, hey, how do other blind students do it? What accommodations and things have they advocated for that have helped enhance their education, right? So I think it just goes back to just being prepared, putting ourselves in the right mindset, which sometimes can be difficult, honestly. And again, it's just recognizing that if you don't open up your mouth and say that something is not right, then everyone else will just assume that it's okay until you flunk that class or until you have to get held back because you never spoke up. Everyone just thought everything was fine. And now they're saying, oh, it's because you couldn't do the work because you never said that we were doing anything wrong and weren't helping you, right? So that's a very long answer to your question, but I hope it kind of brought along highlighted the fact that advocacy is just so important, and learning how to advocate through different means is important as well.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Liz. Your answer was perfect. We really appreciate it. And I'm gonna transition a bit to you, Gabby, and ask the same question, but in addition to that, the disability community is disproportionately negatively impacted in terms of employment. We have super high unemployment rates throughout our community. We're often paid at super low rates as well, whether it is due to discrimination, due to employers not wanting, in addition to discrimination, other ways of discrimination, not wanting to use or get accommodations for people with disabilities. So can you talk a little bit about the advocacy in education, but then also the importance of being an advocate for people with disabilities in employment, and some things that employers should consider when they have people with disabilities that are working in their organization or in their company?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Eric. This is Gabby. I think just to echo what the other two ladies said, I think it's really important for students to learn to advocate for themselves, because you're also going to need those skills when you're going to find a job, right? Unfortunately, we are not in a society yet where we are able to go on an interview and our chances of getting a job are the same as a non-disabled person. Like we're not there yet. So you're going to need the skills to not only advocate for yourself, but know what your rights are. So I think, like Liz said, that starts really young, right? It starts with knowing that children, just because you have a disability, don't necessarily need to be in a special ed class. And it's more about their potential and abilities than like just what everybody says is the thing to do. And so I think if you carry that through, elementary, onto middle and high school, and then through college, and say like, this is up to me. What I need is up to me. There is no cookie cutter answer for, okay, if you have this kind of disability, this is what we do, or this is what's available to you. And I think that that's really important, because there's definitely a tendency to be like, oh, disabled person means this, right? It means we have to do this. It means we have to offer them this. And so knowing yourself well enough to know what you need, and then knowing what your rights are and being like, this is what I'm allowed to ask for, applies both in a college and employment setting. I think there's a lot of stigma around like not disclosing your disability in an employment setting. So I'll just say for myself personally, I don't have that option, right? Because when you roll into a job interview, it's pretty obvious. And so what I've done and what I encourage other people to do is really bring it to those situations as my strength, as like what's taught me to like so many of the skills I'm going to need to be successful at this job or this whatever it is I'm going for. And I think for employers, that's a different perspective, right? Because I'm like, this isn't the burdensome thing that you see it as. This is what's taught me to be the person that I am. This is what's taught me problem solving skills. This is what's taught me resilience. This is what's taught me not to give up on anything, really. And so I'll bring the same skills and passions to this organization or this company or whatever it is. I think once you're there, though, then that's when the conversation needs to shift to in school or in a job. Like, this is how I'm going to be most successful. So this is what I'm going to need. And yes, those conversations can be intimidating, but I think more and more people need to start bringing those to the table so that we don't get caught in this loop of, oh, that's something I'm not supposed to say. Or like the term we use in the community a lot is like forcing ourselves to pass, right? So if we can do something in a way that doesn't require an accommodation, doing it that way so we can pass and not, ruffle any feathers. And that's the opposite to what we should be doing. We should be bringing these issues to the forefront. We should be saying, this is what I need. Do I say that thinking that it's going to be easy to do? No, I don't. I don't want people on here to think I'm like rainbows and butterflies, right? As you said, like we are very disproportionately unemployed. But I think one of the biggest ways to address that is to put it out there, which is consequently also the most intimidating thing to do because of all the other things that were said on this call. So I think just finding your supports, finding people that have done it before, finding people that can support you is one of the best ways to do that. I was fortunate enough to find that in my college setting. Eric, I know you know the U of A pretty well too. So we were really lucky to go to it switches between the second and third most accessible school in the country. And I don't think that our sort of confidence and ability to navigate these things is a coincidence. And the biggest thing I can attribute to that is a community of people that we found that support us and that know what we're going through and that can speak to it. And so I think in any situation, finding your community, finding people that have been there and can kind of help you navigate those challenges is what's most important.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Gabby. Really appreciate that. And just to kind of give a little bit of an additional perspective, I was born with my disability. I was born with congenital hip dislocation. And so I have nerve damage in my left leg, my right foot, and right ankle. And for the first about 14 or 15 years of my life, I did not interact very often with other members of the disability community. Or at least that I knew of. I went to schools where I was often the only individual with a noticeable disability, at least kind of non-invisible disability. And then when I got to high school, I found out about adaptive sports. I had always been an athlete all the way through my childhood and was introduced to adaptive sports when I was in high school. And that's when I first, as Gabby mentioned, being a part of a community and how helpful that can be, I was embraced by other members of the disabled community, in particular, mobility disabilities, people with amputations, spinal cord injuries, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, other disabilities that allowed them to participate in wheelchair basketball, and that really got me kind of energized and excited about being a part of the community. And that was, of course, the introduction. I was able to travel throughout the country and throughout the world and play the sport. And then when I was in college, I met other people with other disabilities, those who are blind, those who are deaf, those with mental health disabilities, worked with them, interned with them, and it really expanded my thought process of what our community, the disabled community, was, and empowered me to be an advocate for people with all disabilities. And even though I've been in this space now for a good period of time, and now I'm in a position where I get to have a good amount of discretion in terms of hiring, or in terms of giving promotions, or other work processes that can give people different opportunities, including disabled people different opportunities. And it's something that is important. And I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in if it weren't for other advocates throughout history who fought to make sure that disabled people could have the opportunities to be in managerial positions and other employment positions, to be able to make some of these decisions to elevate disabled people to positions where they can be empowered, have employment, have security, and really have their lives impacted in a major way. And so, the next kind of set of questions, or the next question that I want to ask you all, is about intersectionality. We haven't gotten to that hotter topic over the last recent years. It wasn't talked about as much when I was younger, back in the Stone Ages. But now it is talked about more. It is used, the term intersectionality is used to refer to, of course, the intersection for people with disabilities in particular that intersect with race or gender, different ethnicities, immigration status, other forms of identity that they experience. And Liz, I'd love to start with you to get your thoughts on intersectionality. We're talking to some people who have never heard the term intersectionality as it relates to the disabled community before. They might have heard it in other aspects of life, whether it's intersection of sports and politics, or intersection of business and education. But what specifically is it about intersectionality for the disabled community that you can speak about?
So, I get a question sometimes, because I have worked with blind children, blind teenagers, blind, transition age youth, to seniors. Like, I've worked with everybody. And I've worked with Spanish speakers. I've even worked with people who speak Russian. I don't know even know how I did it, but I've done it. I don't speak Russian at all, but we were able to do it. And people have asked me like, okay, Liz, so what are some similarities that you see in these different communities? And if I were to put that on a larger spectrum and just say, like disabilities in general, or those of us who maybe didn't speak English during the first part of our lives, or those of us who have multiple disabilities, right? Some of the things that I have found working in all of these areas is that there's a lot of just feeling like you're alone. Like, people do not understand you. Like, there is something wrong with you. Like, when you walk into an interview, with your long white cane, walking up nice and straight, ready to get that job, and you don't get it, that it's because there's something wrong with you, right? So I feel like that is something that, a lot of people experience when you have a disability. Like, you're the one who's broken, you're the one who's wrong. And therefore these opportunities and, being able to go to school or being able to have a really well-paying job may be out of your reach because you are the one who is missing, the 20/20 vision, or the one who has to use a wheelchair. So I think that there is just a lot of, just kind of taking it back upon ourselves as the people with the disability, or as the person who cannot speak English, or as the person who came as an immigrant to this country and now you're trying to find resources. It's the same thing of just being in a situation where it feels like you are the one who is missing something. Like, you are the one, it's your fault for not being born in this country and being able to speak English right off the bat. It's your fault for, not being able to go on dates because you use a cane, and people are afraid of, dating the blind man or the blind person. Again, it's just going back to being the person that is in the situation and taking it and just saying, oh, this is, what I have to deal with, because I was born blind, or because I wasn't born in the US, or because I'm, I have different religious beliefs, or whatever it may be. I feel like it always goes back to making it seem like the person that is in that situation is wrong, where everything else is right, right? So if you aren't a part of this group who can, isn't in a wheelchair, or can see, or speaks English, or have other things like that, all those things that just make it hard for you to even just be comfortable in your own skin. I think that is such a big intersectionality. Like, me being a blind Spanish speaker, I don't know if people treat me differently because I'm blind, because I'm tall, because I'm a woman, because I speak Spanish. But, sometimes it does feel like people just look at me like I have 3 heads, on one body. And then again, I look at it and it's like, it's not me. What is it that makes everyone else think that they're okay, and that I'm the one who is messing everything up by needing accommodations, or by using a cane, or by even asking for descriptions? And I think that's one of the biggest intersectionalities, like when we are in these situations, how we draw it within ourselves. And it can also be because a lot of society kind of makes us feel like we're the ones, that are messed up. So I feel like that is one of the biggest things that I found in working with any group, that is just, we get that feeling of like, we're the ones who are missing something. And that's just, I felt it in many different areas, again, whether because I'm blind, or because I'm a woman, because I speak Spanish, feeling like that is what's making this situation difficult. Not the situation, I'm the one who's making it difficult just by being different, by having a disability, by being a Spanish speaker. And I think that's something that a lot of these different groups might relate to.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Liz. And next I want to go to Kenna. Kenna, you've done so much advocacy in the mental health space. And you know, I mean, there's so much intersectionality, of course, with disability and race, specifically with mental health disabilities. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Of course, this is Kenna. So I would say on the more personal side of it, as a part of the AAPI community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we see a lot of times that there just isn't a lot of conversation around mental health or even just around race in general. I would say this week and the impacts of some of these terrible things that are happening are definitely creating more conversations about it, but at the same time mental health in general is just not a topic that we talk about, and a lot of times it's because of the model minority myth. This is this pervasive idea that Asians are wealthy and successful and we're the quote model of what minorities should be like. And this is a very harmful stereotype in all accounts, not just for the AAPI community, but for all other minorities. But what this creates is essentially a lot of AAPIs are not comfortable talking about mental health and receiving support. There's studies, I think, around the CDC that showed that AAPIs actually have the lowest use of mental health services, as well as the lowest reports of having mental health issues. And a lot of that we wonder is, definitely the collection of data. How is that data collected, but also how educated are AAPI and minority communities around what mental health is in the first place? A lot of times I think about how, our history has really impacted the way that we act and behave. And what we know a lot of times is that a lot of mental health disabilities actually come from trauma, and it comes from a historical trauma, it comes from personal trauma. And so what we're seeing is a lot of times we may have people who are descendants of, again, people who have been refugees, who faced wars, who were in very difficult, violent situations. And these situations do impact our psyche and how we respond to situations. And so a lot of times what we see is that when we don't talk about these traumas, when there isn't resources on how to get through some of these traumas, it then creates more negative coping mechanisms that then lead to additional trauma. And so it is so important for these communities to really have access to support that can help them. But at the same time, as we're talking about it from a more systemic standpoint, we do see that historically, the psychiatric and psychology fields have not been supportive of minorities. And so it is a very interesting situation to say that we do want to have, culturally competent support within the field of psychiatry, but unfortunately, we're not in a place in society where there is a lot of that, at least on a more normalized schedule. And so we said that, for example, as I did my work on college advocacy, we would see that, most of the therapists on campus were white, women and men, but we don't see a lot of people of color. When I was a student at Georgetown, there really wasn't any AAPI therapist, for example. And so it was very interesting to see, how do you then approach these topics in therapy? How do you talk about, racism? How do you talk about trauma? How do you talk about these specific family dynamics when the person that you're talking to may not have an understanding of what that's like and may not understand the gravity of some of these situations because they've never been through them? And Eric and I have had many conversations about this, about how it affects different communities. And so I actually would like to invite Eric, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about how this impacts the Black community. I think our listeners would really benefit from hearing that as well.
Yes, absolutely. This is Eric speaking. And as Kenna has mentioned and as other speakers have mentioned, culture impacts a lot of our perspectives on disability. So, for example, the Black community as a culture has certain difficulties embracing mental health disabilities in particular, and other disabilities. And part of that is based on the experiences that the Black community has had in the United States, which has included, of course, different levels of forced sterilization, forced incarceration and being institutionalized, as well as not being treated fairly or appropriately when when Black people do have concerns relating to mental health or other health disparities. And it's true in other cultures as well, whether it is the Latinx community and some of the cultures that they have within that community, whether you're talking about Mexican culture, Chicano culture, or you're talking about Latin America and Central America, South America. There are certain traditions and beliefs that the Latinx community has that can influence their thoughts on disability. And so if you come with those thoughts and ideas, it can have an impact on particularly children that have disabilities. Once children have a disability and potentially hear or perceive that their family or friends believe that a disability is caused by not praying enough, not being in the right religion, not doing the right things as a mother when you're pregnant, and other situations. All of these can impact how we view disability. And so it's important, as Kenna mentioned, and as others, Liz and Gabby have mentioned, it's so important that as people with disabilities, especially our children, as disabled people or children, that they are in communities that give them a sense of empowerment and a sense of identity, that their disability is not a negative thing. And as we've mentioned, if disabled and disability is positive and not negative, then we should use the terms and we should empower people who are disabled and who have disabilities to be exactly who they are and not feel that they need to hide or sugarcoat. I work at a disability rights protection and advocacy organization in California, Disability Rights California, which is the organization in the state that is funded by the state government or the state bar and the federal government to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. And part of that responsibility includes educating the community, educating not just people who have access to the internet and have access to our offices, but really reaching out and targeting communities that do not normally get in touch with us, communities in the inner city, communities in rural communities throughout the state, so that we can make sure that that our society, our community, and specifically in California, our state is well informed about disability. And if they have questions or need further assistance or resources, that they know that Disability Rights California is available. Of course, there are other amazing disability rights organizations. There are protection and advocacy organizations throughout the country in every state. And then there are other organizations, independent living centers. There are organizations for deaf individuals, for blind individuals, for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, with mental health disabilities. These are all resources. And what we're going to do is work with FARA to ensure that you all have access to some of the resources that we suggest. The four of us have been in the advocacy space for people with disabilities and the disabled community for such a long time that we know the direction to point the community in. So with that, I'd love to go to Gabby on the next question. I'd love it if you could speak a little bit about intersectionality, Gabby, but also, we are currently all on Zoom right now because of the global pandemic. And what is portrayed on the news and reported, of course, the CDC reports, everybody has reported that people of color have been disproportionately harmed by COVID, and not just have contracted the disease, and also are more likely to have to go to the hospital, are more likely to die. And of course, over the last couple of months or so, access to the vaccine has been an issue that many communities have been advocating for, including the disabled community, and especially the disabled community that intersects with race, the Latinx community, the Black community, the API community, have all been pushing as hard as they can to make sure that they're included in this process. And can you speak a little bit about some of the advocacy that you've seen, and maybe what you would suggest to policymakers? I saw recently that Arizona has now made the vaccine available to all of the people over the age of 16. But just from what you've observed, or from what you've seen in your advocacy work, how intersectionality, disability, and COVID kind of all interact with each other right now.
Sure, Eric, that's a great question. This is Gabby. I think one of the things that COVID has really highlighted, I mean, it's been a really hard year for everybody, no matter who you are. We've all been affected by this pandemic. And as a mental health professional, I think it's just important to say that we should all be giving ourselves some grace right now, because we've all been through it. But I think the disability community especially, it's highlighted that unfortunately disabled lives are not valued. Right? And that might sound like a harsh way to put it, but that's the truth. There have been multiple stories in the media across the country where disabled people were denied care when diagnosed with COVID because there were, quote, other people that needed the resources. And it's, that's a prime example of saying, well, we're looking at what we consider quality of life. We're going to put the disabled person last. And that's a really, really unfortunate product of how our society views disability. And I think when you look at it from an intersectional standpoint, right, and as you brought up and the other people on the call have brought up, there's certain privileges that come with different aspects of people's identities. And so as a white disabled woman, for instance, I know that I have to acknowledge my white privilege, right? That's a valid part of my experience. But then as a disabled woman, there are other parts of my experience where I do have to advocate for myself and for my rights. And I think COVID in particular has brought that to a head. So you're being forced to advocate not only for the medical care that you need, but also to be seen as a valued member of our society. I mean, look at what happened in New York when Governor Cuomo decided that where people were going to go if they had COVID was nursing homes. Who lives in nursing homes? Disabled people live in nursing homes. Okay, that's a prime example of saying those lives don't matter as much as the other ones that we need to be protecting. Where does that come from? That comes from the idea that if you're a disabled individual, your life is not as worth living as somebody else's. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that's what these stereotypes and these perspectives on disability cause. And that's why we need a counter narrative that we're trying to create here today, and that, the resources we've given you guys will help us create, but it needs to come from non-disabled people too, because they make up the rest of the world. And if they don't value our lives, we've done a lot. We've come a long way, as people like to point out, but we can't finish that process without additional support. And I think just seeing the amount of people whose lives have been even more affected being a disabled individual in this pandemic. It just highlights that needs to happen. It needs to happen even more. And I think when you look at things like the mask mandate, for example, first of all, I don't know why it's so hard to wear a mask. That's the first problem. But secondly, it's like, you're not doing it for you necessarily. If you're a young, healthy person that says, I don't need this. But what about the disabled person who literally hasn't left their house since last March? Because you can't be responsible enough to protect our society. It's like we've been receiving these messages all year long. And I think it's just really brought that to a head. And I know I've seen a lot of questions from people that registered asking like what allies can do and what people who are not a part of this community can do. And I think this is a prime example of, you know, all of us doing our part, because we can't advocate solely for ourselves without the support of everybody else.
This is Eric. Thank you so much, Gabby. And I'm going to go to you, Liz. I see you. Thank you so much for bringing up allies. And Liz, in your response, can you talk a little bit about allies and why allies are really important? And then also, of course, you know, the COVID question, intersectionality, and your response.
Yeah, great. So this is Liz. So one of the things that we have encountered in the blind community in regards to being able to get a COVID vaccine is that, you know, they'll have these pop-up clinics, you know, and they'll say, oh, we have vaccines or whatever. And then you get on the website and it's not accessible for a screen reader. And so great, the resource is there. Anyone who can see can get a COVID vaccine, but because you're using a screen reader, you don't have the same access to that. And there have been people who have been missing out on vaccinations because they can't get online and register to do it. And if you think about, you know, what about if you had a blind Spanish speaker? Man, you know, like they're really out of luck, because if the English website doesn't work, you know, do you think that there's going to be a Spanish one or even in any other language to accommodate a blind person who's using a screen reader? So just really seeing that, you know, and again, it's that one thing like, yeah, I know that there's a big hurry to get these vaccines out, but if someone would just take like 10 minutes before they put these things out there and really think about like, hey, do you think blind people want to get the COVID vaccine? Yeah. Do you think that this website is going to work for them? I'm not sure. Let's find out. You know, they could be potentially saving the lives of so many blind people out there, because as Gabrielle said, our lives are just as valuable as anyone else's. So we should have access to be able to get online and get a COVID vaccine when we get an email saying that there's one available, right? So again, it's just that thing where it's kind of an afterthought. And then when the blind person comes back and says, hey, this website isn't accessible, they look at you like you're the one who's the problem, right? So really just being able to have a better understanding of that and how like those small things really do impact our community. Not being able to get a COVID vaccine. Another thing like social distancing, like I've heard that, you know, that some places they'll have like big circles drawn out where you're supposed to stand to social distance from someone. Well, that's nice, but what if you can't see the circle? Right? And so things like that, again, it's just an afterthought, like not really thinking about, you know, not just the, you know, person that's going to come in here that's perfectly, you know, physically able to do everything. Like, what about the rest of us? Right? So really, again, it's just that intersectionality of knowing that someone didn't really put the thought into thinking about this part of my life or this community, and feeling like it's an afterthought. And that's just one of the biggest things that I think like this pandemic has done to us. I forgot the other part of your question, Eric. Could you remind me, please? I just got so caught up in the COVID thing that I really wanted to talk about that.
No, I really appreciate it. This is Eric. It goes back to allies. You know, a lot of people have asked us the question about how to be a good ally, especially obviously if you are not disabled or if you do not know, you know, or have a community around you with many disabled people. What are some things that allies can think about, and what are some things that they can do to show support?
Great, thank you. Thanks for the refresher. So again, this is Liz. I guess the one advice or the biggest thing that I want to get across is just because you've met one disabled person doesn't mean you've met them all, right? Just because you met one blind person doesn't mean that, oh, I met Liz and, you know, she wore a leopard shirt and she loved talking about blindness, so I have everything I need to know about blindness. That is absolutely not true, because I am just one blind person in this great big world, and you're just listening to my opinion. This is how I feel. I've been blind for 20 years. I work in orientation and mobility, so my perspectives are going to be different from the next blind person you meet, because they might not be an orientation and mobility instructor. They may not feel as confident about speaking in terms of advocacy, or even being able to have a full conversation about what they need, because we're not all the same. So to really truly be an ally, that means a dialogue needs to happen. That means that if you encounter a blind person, you're not going to treat them like like what you think that person wants to be treated like, because then you are basing it off of that disability, not that person. And that is the most damaging thing that I feel that the world does to those of us with disabilities, is when they put us in a box based on the fact that we need a device like a cane to get around, or a wheelchair to be able to move. Then they want to put us in a box because of their own preconceived notions. So if you really want to be an ally, when you encounter someone with a disability, treating that person like that person is, right? Not, oh, I'm going to treat this person like I treat a blind person. Well, who says that there's a certain way that you treat people who are blind, right? There is no book on how to handle your blind person. So the best way to figure out how to be an ally to me is by sitting down and having a conversation with me, getting to know me. If you talk to me, you would find out that my blindness, I've minimized it to an inconvenience. It's not this big traumatic thing in my life right now. Doesn't mean it was always this way. So if you were to have sat me down and asked me this question 10 years ago, my response would have been way different from what it is now. So again, to truly be an ally is to see each person individually for who they are, not based on their disability, not saying, well, how should I treat a blind person? Again, there is how do you treat anybody, right? So one of the things that I really tell my students a lot, especially when I'm getting ready to send them out into this great big scary world, is that, you are the one who's going to be in charge of making your blindness an inconvenience. You are the one who's going to decide when you don't need help. And if there are people around you who want to impose what they think they should do, then you need to advocate, right? So if we start changing the perspectives of those allies, those people that want to interact with us, and say, hey, you just need to treat me like you would any person. And as the things come up where I may need an accommodation or where I may need help, then we can have a dialogue that's going to be based on both of us, not just one person. Yeah. So I think that's the biggest thing I think that I want to say is that question would be kind of like saying, well, how do I treat, a Black person that walks into the room? Man, what kind of, you can't even ask that, right? So that's my question, starting that dialogue case by case with that person, seeing that person for who they are and not their disability.
Thank you so much, Liz. We really appreciate your response. And Kenna, I'd love to go to you next on allyship, and you can speak about what an ally is for the disabled community, and what some of the expectations are from people with disabilities, from the disabled community, from allies.
This is Kenna. Thank you so much for that question, Eric. I think allyship is particularly interesting when it comes to the mental health community. A lot of times it's just that we may not all have mental health disabilities, but we all have mental health, and we have mental health that can become mental health disabilities. So Gabby said this in the beginning of our conversation, but disability really is one of those identities where, sometimes you may be in the disability community and have a disability, sometimes you may not, all within the same lifetime. And so it's very interesting when we talk about disability and allyship, especially amongst mental health. Because of that, though, I think one of the things that I do want to point out in terms of allyship, if you don't have a mental health disorder at the moment, is also just recognizing that, allyship looks like respecting people with mental health issues as well. And so kind of piggybacking off of Liz's amazing comments about this, it's also just acknowledging that people with mental health disabilities are people as well. The media likes to make people with disabilities, especially psychiatric disabilities, out to be some sort of dangerous, at worst, or lazy at best stereotype, when in reality, it's just people who are living their lives. I know, especially now with a lot of things going on in the last few weeks around gun violence, one of the biggest issues is sort of the scapegoating of gun violence towards people with mental illness, when in reality, people with mental illness are just as violent as the population of people without mental health disabilities. And so I think it's very interesting to see that this is not a dynamic that's really discussed within our society because it's inconvenient. And so what I would ask in terms of allyship is just recognizing that people with mental health disabilities are people, and that they deserve to be treated with love and respect just the same as anyone without a disability.
Great. This is Eric. Thank you so much, Kenna, and thank all three of you guys so much for those responses. Another comment that I wanted to be sure that I made regarding allyship, as everybody has mentioned, a big part of allyship is literally communicating with disabled people. Starting off there, because disabled people don't expect everyone else to know everything about disability. But what comes with the respect of being an ally includes being willing to acknowledge that you might not know everything about disability, and that it is important, and you can gain a lot of knowledge and perspective by just sitting down and having a conversation. And as others have mentioned before, and I know that I have experienced this with my disability, everybody is at different stages with their disability. Whether you were born with your disability, have lived with it your entire life, or whether you acquired it later in life, or whether you became comfortable later in life with your disability identity, everyone has an individual perspective on how they view their disability. And that is something that's really important to recognize, because not everybody feels comfortable disclosing or discussing their disability. We have all mentioned, as being advocates, the different levels of accommodations, the different levels of disability. And as Gabby mentioned earlier, some of us are really in privileged positions. I mentioned earlier that I am a Black male, Black disabled man, but I also recognize the privilege that I have as an individual who got to graduate from college and law school, as an individual who has both of my parents in my life, who supported me as I grew up and still support me today, as an individual who was born in the United States, as an individual who has certain appearance privileges with my disability. My disability as a wheelchair user is viewed in many circumstances as an acceptable disability. Other disabilities, such as certain mental health disabilities, certain intellectual and developmental disabilities, other disabilities that make certain non-disabled people especially, but other disabled people as well, more uncomfortable. I know that I have certain privileges in that space. And it is important that those voices and the experiences of all people with all different types of disabilities are lifted up and taken into account. So I tie all that into allyship, because as an ally, it is important that when you think of diversity in the workplace, diversity in schools, that you're not only considering the wheelchair user, that you're not only considering somebody who is deaf or blind, but that you are considering the wide range and diverse perspectives of all disabilities that we've discussed here today. And as an ally, it is important that, especially when in the employment space, that you consistently educate yourself to the best of your ability on ways to make reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities, and to make sure that you are asking anybody who is employed by you, anybody that you work with. I want to give kudos right now to Tara, because I mean to Farah, I'm sorry, because of her willingness to make reasonable accommodations on this Zoom call. The Zoom call at first did not necessarily include some of the accommodations that certain disabled people ask for or require. And that included ASL, American Sign Language interpretation, that includes closed captioning. And she even offered in the beginning of this conversation to anybody who might have additional ideas for accommodations, that they are included and that they feel empowered to reach out to her and reach out to her team about additional accommodations that can be met. So I think that that is an example of the type of allyship that we are speaking about here. And you can implement that in your own place of work, in your school, within your families, and other conversations that you might have about accessibility, about diversity, and inclusion. I think that those elements are super important.
I just wanted to highlight a few comments that have come through. We had a couple of responses earlier. One says, love that, seeing people for who they are, support the person and not the disability. There's no script on support, get to know the person. And then earlier on, we had a comment in response to Liz. It says, Liz, as an immigrant native Spanish speaker, I relate to how having an accent or not having mastery of English is stereotyped as dumb or stupid. Thank you for addressing this. How can we support addressing microaggressions in the workplace towards disabled people? Is there corporate training that you know of?
Yes, this is Eric. So thank you for that question. There are a number of organizations, a number of businesses led by disabled people, especially, who can give workplace trainings on not only diversity, equity, and inclusion, but specifically on issues relating to the disabled community. And we can, as a group, I know the four of us have access to some examples of businesses and organizations that can help with workplace trainings and just giving advice. And sometimes on their websites, these organizations have some information about how to make sure that disabled people at the workplace feel included and empowered. So we can definitely follow up, unless anybody has any specific examples on the panel. So yeah, I think right now we'll plan on following up and giving some examples of some organizations that can help.
Well, thank you to each of you, Eric, Kenna, Gabrielle, Liz. Thank you to our incredible ASL interpreters, Teresa and Julia. I'm just most grateful for each of you for your time. for your thoughtfulness. Thank you to each of you who showed up to listen and learn. Showing up is very much part of allyship. So thank you for being here. I'm just going to read out a few of these comments. Thank you to everyone who participated today. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and expertise. As a disabled student working to establish structural supports on campus without a disabled community to lean on currently, it is very encouraging to see talks like this and to see disabled professionals working to improve access to advocacy and community. This was an unbelievable panel, indeed unbelievable. Thank you, Leslie. This was a great session. Thank you so much to each of you for your openness, and I wish you each continued success. Thank you, Farah, for creating these spaces. Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for, making them consistent. Farside Fridays started as a seed of an idea, and it's the community that has kept it going. So thank you all.